Okay, I think I should probably get us started tonight. I'm Ann Herder-Rapp. I'm a professor on campus. I'm also on the Shared Reading Committee and the Program Planning Committee. So I have the pleasure tonight of introducing our speaker. But I have a rather long introduction first, so get comfortable. I want to welcome you to this event of the Journeys to American Identities series. This is sponsored by the new Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, WIPPS. And WIPPS is housed on campus, but it's a venture that's jointly affiliated with the UW colleges and UW Extension. And WIPPS's this is hard to get out. WIPPS's mission is to enhance the civic life of communities throughout Wisconsin with educational outreach, internships, service learning, public scholarship, nonpartisan public dialogue, and dissemination of ideas generated through research and programming. WIPPS would like to acknowledge the generous, very generous financial support of a number of groups sponsoring tonight's event, and one of which is the Wisconsin Humanities Council, but also the UWMC Student Life and Interest Committee, the Alexander Foundation, the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation, the UW System Race and Ethnicity Institute, and the WIPPS inaugural donors. And it's through the support and efforts of many that we were able to bring Andrew Lamb here tonight. I'd also like to invite you to, after the question and answer session tonight, to turn in the evaluations that Jean and others have been handing out to you with pencils now. There'll be boxes outside the theater that you can deposit those in. And these evaluations are important because they allow us to assess, to use that awful word, to assess our events and track what you're interested in. You're also invited to a book signing afterwards in the terrace room to the right on your way out. And Andrew will be there. You can mingle with him. You can get him to sign your book. You can buy a book if you don't already have one. And then you can also pick up WIPPS brochures there if you'd like, or you can get yourself on the WIPPS mailing list if you'd like to know about additional events in the future. There are a couple of upcoming events that I wanted to draw your attention to. And next Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at 7:30, and then Sunday at 2 o'clock in the UWMC Theater, with the support of WIPPS, we present an original production, Through the Red, White, and Blue. It's an original performance piece created by UWMC students that are enrolled in community-based theater class. And this is working in response to the Journeys to American Identities theme. And it combines satire, poetry, multimedia presentations to explore heritage. And the performance also includes two pieces from Bamboo Among the Oaks, an earlier WIPPS program, as well as the Wausau rap song. It'll be interesting. And then in addition, our next event after that is on Tuesday, December 4th at 7 o'clock in the theater. And that one is a panel discussion, Shamanism and Cultural Identity. And it features anthropologist Dr. Gary Yi Ali from Concordia University and our own Dr. Ron Lippy, and then local shaman Kua Gurli. And that's scheduled again for Tuesday, December 4th. We are quite fortunate tonight to, of course, have as our guest writer and National Public Radio commentator. Indeed, that's how many of us were introduced to him to begin with. We heard him on NPR first, Andrew Lamb. And Andrew's book, Perfume Dreams, which many of our students have read and he'll read from tonight, was the winner of the PEN American Beyond the Margins Award and a finalist for the Asian American Literature Award. He's published essays, both fiction and nonfiction, in numerous collections as well as the New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Tribune, and elsewhere. And he has a new book coming out, Grandma's Tales. Of Perfume Dreams, Maxine Hong Kingston had this to say. She said, Andrew Lamb writes with the honesty of a true journalist and the feeling of a born storyteller. On his many journeys between Vietnam and the U.S., he sees firsthand the global consequences of war. Perfume Dreams, she says, is a meaningful book for our times. And then in a LA Times book review, Jonathan Kirch had this to say, Lam confronts the barriers of language, experience, and aspiration that separate his Vietnamese origins from his American destiny. Lam is a journalist by profession, but he writes with the delicacy and intensity of a poet. Tonight, I think you'll hear that delicacy and intensity, but in his own words, in the author's voice. So without further delay, I give you Andrew Lam.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is my first time to this region of America, and I have to confess my ignorance. Before I got here, I'm a totally West Coast boy, and the only thing I know about this region is Garrison, Keeler, and of course Fargo. But I have to say that some stereotypes are good. I mean, everyone I've met so far has been so nice. And that's great because, I can't guarantee that if you go to San Francisco, even you're supposed to put a flower in your hair. So I guess tonight I'm going to take 30 minutes or so reading from my book, and two segments, really. One is the beginning of my Americanization process, then leaving of my home and so on in Vietnam. And the other one is really, it's about my effort of going back, at least in addressing the past. And after that, talk a little bit and we can open up for Q&A. And if there's no Q&A, I'm just gonna keep talking. I'm used to that. So this first section is in the Child Two Worlds. On April 28, 1975, 2 days before Saigon fell to the Communist Army and the Vietnam War ended, my family and I boarded a cargo plane full of panicked refugees and headed for Guam. I remember watching Vietnam recede into a cloudy horizon from the plane's window, a green mass of land giving way to a hazy green sea. I was 11 years old. I was confused, frightened, and from all available evidence, the khaki army tents in the Guam refugee camp, the scorching heat, the long lines for food rations, the fetid odor of the communal latrines, the flesh freshly bulldozed ground under my sandaled feet. I was also homeless. Places and times when they can no longer be retrieved tend to turn sacrosanct. Home forever lost is forever bathed in certain twilight glow. Even after many years in America, my mother still longed for the ancestral altar in which Grandpa's faded black and white photo stared out into our abandoned home. She missed the carved rosewood cabinet in which she kept the enamel-covered family albums and my father's special French wines from Bordeaux. And she yearned for the antique porcelain dining set covered by faded blue silk. She fretted over the small farm we owned near the Bin Lai Bridge outside on the outskirts of Saigon, where the chickens roamed freely and the mangosteen and guava trees were heavy with fruits when we last visited, and where the river, dotted with water hyacinths, ran swift and strong. This is the time of year when the guavas back home are ripened, Mother would tell the family at dinner time. So far from home, Mother nevertheless took her reference point in autumn, her favorite season. Autumn, the dark season, came in the form of letters she received from relatives and friends left behind. Brown and flimsy, thin, like dead leaves, recycled who knows how many times, the letters threatened to dissolve with a single tear. They unanimously told of tragic lives. Auntie and her family barely survived. Cousin is caught for the umpteenth time trying to escape. Uncle has died from heart failure while being interrogated by the Viet Cong. Yet another uncle is indefinitely incarcerated in a malaria-infested re-education camp. And no news yet of cousin and family who disappeared in the South China Sea. The letters went on to inquire as to our health, then to timidly ask for money, for antibiotics, for a bicycle, and if possible, for sponsorship to America. The letters confirmed what my mother, who had lived through 2 wars, had always known. Life is a sea of suffering, and sorrow gives meaning to life. Then, as if to anchor me in old world tragedy, as if to bind me in that shared narrative of loss and misery, Mother insisted that I, too, read those letters. What did I do? I skimmed. I skipped. I shrugged. I put on a poker face and raked autumn in a pile and pushed it all back to her. That country, I slowly announced in English as if to wound, is cursed. That country, mind you, no longer mine. Vietnam was now so far away, an abstraction, and America was now so near, outside a window, blaring on TV, written in the science fiction books I devoured like mad, a seduction. Besides, what could a scrawny refugee teenager living in America do to save uncle from that malaria-infested re-education camp? What could he do for cousin and her family lost somewhere in the vast South China Sea? He could, on the other hand, pretend amnesia to save himself from grief. My mother made the clucking sounds of disapproval with her tongue as she shook her head. She looked into my eyes and called me the worst thing she could muster. You've become a little American now, haven't you? A cowboy. Vietnamese appropriated the word cowboy from the movies to imply selfishness. A cowboy in Vietnamese estimation is a rebel who, as in spaghetti westerns, leaves town, the communal life, to ride alone into the sunset. Mother's comment smarted, but she wasn't far from the truth. Her grievances against America had little to do with the war and the United States' involvement in it. Her complaint against America was that it had stolen her children, especially her youngest and once most filial son. America seduced him with its optimism, twisted his thinking, bent his tongue, and dulled his tropic memories. America gave him freeways and fast food and silly cartoons and sitcoms, imbuing him with sappy, happy ending incitements. Yet it could not be helped. For the refugee child in America, the world splits perversely into two irreconcilable parts, inside and outside. Inside, at home in the crowded apartment shared by two refugee families, nostalgia ruled. Inside, the world remained dedicated to what was. Remember the house we used to live in with the red bougainvillea wavering over the iron gate? Remember when we went to Hue and sailed down the perfumed river for the night market, and that night the sky was full of stars? Remember Ted, when Uncle showed us the trick with the cards? Inside, the smell of fish sauce wafted along with the smell of incense from the newly built altar that housed photos of the dead, a complex smell of loss. Inside, the refugee father told and retold wartime stories to his increasingly disaffected children, reliving the battles he had fought and won. He stirred his whiskey and soda on ice and stared blankly at the TV. Inside, the refugee mother grieved for lost relatives, lost home and hearth, lost ways of life, a whole cherished world of intimate connections, scattered and uprooted, gone, gone, all gone. And so, inside, I, their refugee child, felt the collected weight of history on my shoulders and fell silent. Outside, however, what do you want to be when you grow up? Mr. K, the English teacher in 8th grade, asked. I had never thought of the question before. Such an American question. But it intrigued me. I did not hesitate. A movie star, I answered, laughing. Outside, I was ready to believe, to swear that the Vietnamese child who grew up in that terrible war and who saw many strange, tragic, and marvelous things was someone else, not me. That it had happened in another age, centuries ago. That Vietnamese boy never grew up. He wandered still in the garden of my childhood memory, whereas I had gone on, hadn't I? It was a feeling that I could not help. I came to America at a peculiar age, pubescent and not fully formed. Old enough to remember Vietnam, I was also young enough to embrace America. and to be shaped by it. Outside, in school, among new friends, I spoke English freely and deliberately. I whispered sweet compliments to Chinese and Filipino girls and made them blush. I cussed and joked with friends and made them laugh. I bantered and cavorted with teachers and made myself their pet. Speaking English, I had a markedly different personality than when speaking Vietnamese. In English, I was a sunny, upbeat, silly, and sometimes wickedly sharp-tongued kid. No sorrow, no sadness, no cataclysmic grief clung to my new language. A wild river full of possibilities flowed effortlessly from my tongue, connecting me to the new world. And I, enamored by the discovery of a newly invented self, I sailed its iridescent waters toward spring. And then, then this is the return part. You cannot go not without return in some way. So this is in a chapter called Notes of a Warrior's Son. So are you sad you lost the war? Remigio asked. There were times, dear Remigio, when I was very envious of you. History happened to others on TV, and you who grew up where everyone else wanted to live, could always change the channel. Other times I felt sorry for you. Your immunity from history robs you of the awe and appreciation of seeing how its powerful flow and surge can change everyone near and far. Unappreciative of your own history, you are deprived of the marvels of the history of others. In the center of the empire, the happenings of the world seem to have barely touched you at all. Yet, your question after all these years still leaves me breathless. Decades have passed since helicopters carried refugees away from the American embassy's rooftop, and communist tanks rolled through the city where I once lived. And still I find myself some gray morning quite unexpectedly struggling to rise above the sadness. Transnationalism, multiculturalism, citizens of the world. These speak of a bright and enlightened age of a post-Cold War era, a world of freedom and openness, one that I latch onto readily in contrast to what had been previously my predicament: exile, refugee, minority, South Vietnamese, war's loser. Sometimes it feels as if the world of the multilingual, sophisticated cosmopolitan is but a salve, a compensation to the unhealed wounds of exile, a veil over immense losses. It has taken me a long, long time to come to the realization that for those whose lives have been inordinately altered by forces of history, the personal is to the historical the way brooks and rivers are to the sea. James Baldwin's riddle is rhetorical after all, when he asks in one piercing essay, which of us has overcome his past? And promptly answers in another, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Take love, for example. When I began to write, it was not about the war or its aftermath. I wrote about my own broken heart. I tried to capture what it was like to lose someone who had been my preoccupation throughout my college life, who was then, in fact, my life. I was too close to the subject, as it turned out, too hurt to do the story justice. But the raw emotions unearthed another set of older memories simmering underneath. To lose someone you loved dearly, someone with whom you cared, created an intimate world, with whom you share a private language and a routine, is to be exiled. Yet, I have been exiled before. The broken-hearted adult found himself re-experiencing the emotions of the broken-hearted child who stood alone on the beach of Guam, missing his classmates, his dogs, fretting about his father, wondering if he'll ever see his homeland again. So I wrote some more. My sadness opened a trapdoor to the past. Memories came gushing up, made themselves clear once more. A child forced to flee, the long line for food under a punishing sun in a green city made of army tents, people weeping themselves to sleep, the altar where faded photographs of the dead stared out forlornly, the incense still burning, but the living gone. I yearned for my memories. I wrote some more. I began to go back. If one cannot escape one's history, one ought to embrace it fully. Dear Remy Jo, but by embrace I do not mean to dwell in the losses or to live in the constant state of mourning, or worse still, to be bound by lost glories. The more mature response to one's tragedy is not hatred nor resentment, but spiritual resilience with which one can and again struggle to transcend one's own biographical limitations. History is trapped in me indeed, but history is also mine to work out, to disseminate, to discern and appropriate, and to finally transform into aesthetic self-expression. To put it another way, one can, with due respect, James Baldwin's grim discernment with Anne Scott Marmaday's astute counsel. Anything is bearable as long as you can make a story out of it. I think I'll stop here. Thank you. I can open for questions, or I can read some more. It's up to you. Yeah.
If no one else, I think there's ways in which the experience of being a refugee and coming to this country is different for males than for females. I think men, I see them from my friends, families that I see, men feel they're giving up more.
Yeah.
They are. I mean,
Sure.
It's a less patriarchal culture here sometimes than it is in some other countries. But do you think that the first generation children, that some of those issues are also true in terms of male children versus female children, if their fathers tend to be more disengaged than their mothers?
I think there is a discrepancy in terms of immigrant and refugee experience in the gender, but I think it has also to do with economic status and status in society. A lot of time in Vietnam and other places in the old world, women don't have very high status in their own country. And when they get to the United States, they suddenly find that they can make as much money as their husbands. And because in some way, adult refugee and immigrant women learn the language faster than men. That's been kind of statistically proven. So that in fact, they actually have better jobs. So they're... And they gain and the men lose. And so it creates all kind of discrepancy within the family because the women feel more independence, whereas the men feel less in control. And some of the major reasons for domestic violence in refugee families have to do with that discrepancy between men and women.
Do you think then that there's a differential impact on the children in those families?
I'm sure, I mean, you know, I gotta have to have that. My situation's a little bit different because my father, who was a super achiever in his homeland, went to the United States, and after a year or so of being traumatized by the war, he picked himself up and became very successful in the United States. So he went on to get an MBA and CPA, and then he became a bank executive after having fought the war for 25 years, and brought us out of poverty. So he stayed proud. And in a way, that saved their marriage, my parents, because when he didn't work, my mom was threatening to leave him in the United States after first year, which is kind of shocking because she was willing to die with him in Vietnam, but she wasn't willing to live with him in America. You know, and so he had to pick himself out of his rut, basically. Sure. More questions? Yeah.
In your first reading, you talked about American optimism.
Yeah.
Happy, everything's happy, so on and so forth. And then the second essay, you have a big mouth. Then you talk about in the second essay about The impression I got is it's almost like America sees itself as almost not in history, the kind of history of it. Do you think then that perhaps American culture is somehow, at least in its delusional in a way that it's not seeing itself as part of history, or is just experiencing the world very differently than the rest of the world does?
I think because even when we have war, it was, besides the American Civil War, it was not waged inside the border of the United States. So there is this weird remove with history, even though, of course, it affects all of us. I mean, the current war affects us in so many different ways, but it's not a direct experience necessarily. So we're kind of removed, even though history is changing us very quickly. You only need to look at the price gases. So, but the thing is, I think we are now repeating history because we are not experience history fully. For instance, people are always shocked why the parallel between Iraq and Vietnam is so obvious that we are not doing something about it. And it's in part because we see a lot of intellectuals have been writing about the parallel between Iraq and Vietnam. And yet, here we are fully engaged in the same mistakes over. And so the question is whether or not we're fully take advantage of our memory of history. You know, there is something strange like amnesia that has an effect on all of us here in the United States. Yeah.
How big of an impact do you think TV has had on immigrant culture?
TV?
Yeah. What role does TV play?
That's interesting. I would say, you know, the VCR has more of an impact. For instance, between the period of 1975 to 1981, all we had was the TV. And back then, there were no programming for any ethnic group. You just got ABC, CBS, and NBC. And this is all you have in common is you can talk about it at the cooler, right? Like, did you see, you know, Three's Company or whatever? God, what an old show. But anyway, but that was when, you know, the media was very consolidated. And then I remember when the VCR came, and suddenly my parents got all these tapes from Hong Kong, you know, and they put it in and it's dubbed into Vietnamese, and we were watching Hong Kong Kung Fu movie. So we were already radicalizing ourselves by taking a different route because the TV was not, we didn't choose to watch Three Company. That was the only choice we had back then. But the moment we got the VCR, we pushed that VHS tape in and we were watching other stuff that was non-mainstream. And that was the beginning of the change, I thought. And then, of course, now we have the ethnic media being very powerful. You know, even Hmong has radio stations, and you know, and the Vietnamese have TV, internet, and so you're seeing fragmentation of the media now because, in some way, the ABC, NBC kind of world is no longer have the monopoly over the medium. It was so interesting because recently Fox TV was claiming having such a large viewership, and that was 12% of American viewers. You know, and to them that was really big because, you know, there's so many different channels. You know, you have cable, you can watch anything in 110 different languages. So, man, you know, you can choose anything you want. I mean, I don't watch TV anymore. I watch YouTube because there's there's a lot of things that, you know, I like Japanese anime. So I still like animation. But, and I watched that, and there was no way I would have been able to watch that a year ago. You know, so people's tastes are now being catered to because the choices are multiple. Yeah.
Could you describe a little bit about your process of becoming a writer, going from studying science to writing?
Okay, my process of becoming a writer. I was a biochem major at Berkeley, and I was a pre-med. And then I mentioned a little bit in the reading that, you know, there was a romance. and the romance fell apart. That was my first romance. And so I thought, well, I'm studying the MCAT, I'm going to med school, but I'm going to take creative writing so that I can talk about my broken heart, because to me that was like the major thing. And so I took creative writing about my big romance, and lo and behold, I started talking what it's like to lose someone you share your life with, and who you created a pattern of, a universe with. And when you lose that someone, I was equating it to losing a country. And the moment I made that equation, I realized I wasn't talking about my romance, I was talking about my history. And then the words started pouring out of me, and I started writing about what it's like to be a refugee child, what it's like to live in a refugees camp, and and then my creative writing teacher say, Andrew, you're not going to medical school, you're going to creative writing program. And then my first response was, my mother is going to kill me. Because she got the kid into Berkeley, they save money and they send me there, and they've been boasting about the kid going to become a doctor. And so when I actually got into the creative writing program, I had to tell my parents that I'm not going to medical school, and my mother was so shocked, and she's like, oh, I knew it, sending you to Berkeley was a mistake because it's full of hippies. And my father, being the MBA guy, was very practical. He said, well, I want to be a poet. Do you see me writing poetry? And he said, well, why don't you study on the side, like writing something on the side, but name for me, this is 1989, 1990, name for me a Vietnamese who was making a living as a writer in America. And, mind you, the Vietnamese experience in America only began in 1975 when the war ended. So it was 15 years old by the time I wanted to become a writer. And my father's challenge was, of course, a big challenge, because I couldn't name a Vietnamese making a living in America as a writer. So I just kind of got cocky, and I said, well, damn it, I'm gonna be the first one. And I can see the look in his eyes. It's like, wow, okay, so this kid got guts, right? Because, and then, but it didn't really end there. But basically, they say, well, we had a talk over, and we save money, and we can give you money if you go to dental school if medical school is too hard. And I thought, wow, how funny, hello, I want to be a writer. But it was a very difficult struggle for the first few years, because, I had to convince them and myself at the same time. Here I am writing in a third language. I spoke French before English, and so have to convince them that I can do it, and convince myself that I have the guts and the talent for it. So it was a long struggle, I thought, a few years before I could say, okay, I think I got what it takes. And so when I started winning awards, I wrote a lot of articles for newspapers, and they changed their mind. So now if you visit my parents, you have to do this obligatory walk where you have to look at Andrew Lamb's awards, because every time I win an award, I give it to them. So there's this mantle place where you have to do this walk before they pour tea for you. So they changed their mind, I guess. Anybody else? I have to put my glasses on. Can't see. Yeah.
I was actually curious, what was your experience with coming from Vietnam to America? I'm assuming you didn't really have much traveling, in Vietnam. You didn't travel around too often. So what was the experience like traveling from there to the US?
Yeah. Well, I did travel a lot in Vietnam because my father was a general, so I was an army brat. But I never got outside of Vietnam during the war. And when I was a child, I really thought the border were real, like the way we drew the map, and so I thought the borders were actual physical thing, and you have to have some kind of magical power to go over it, because so few people can do it. And my father was one of them, because he went to France and the United States, but the rest of us don't have this strength to cross this border. I'm not sure why that was so big in my mind. And so when they told me that I had just left Vietnam and we were in this C-130 cargo plane going out, and looking down and Vietnam disappeared and it was all ocean, I kind of freaked out. I didn't know where we were going, and also I didn't know anything about time zones. You know, if you live in only one time zone, you don't know about other time zones. So it didn't make any sense where the sun was going down and the sun was going back up again. And I started freaking out again, like, my God, you know, it's something weird going on. But I didn't know how to articulate any of this stuff. So it was very strange. And even stranger too, when we got into the refugee camp that was part of the army barracks, and they built tents for us there. And this sounds really weird, but I was so fascinated with the Coke machines. Because, you know, only in America that you put, well, now everywhere, but in those days, only in America that you put money in and something sell you something, but it's not a human being that sell you something. And then you get to choose from all this light. You know, in Vietnam, you know, you have oil lamps that by 8 p.m. you don't, you know, so the idea you can go out and there is this machine like a robot, and it glows with all these beautiful lights, and you pick something and it comes out in a can. I don't know why, but I stared at it like all night. You know, like, my God, this machine is magical. I know it's weird, but you know, my fascination was with the Coke machine.
Has your parents, relatives, and other Vietnamese Americans read your book?
Yeah.
React any differently?
This was asked earlier this morning. I say my parents are proud and happy that I made it as a writer, but the other caveat is that they're very wary. Because, and I'm not sure where I said this morning, but I said that, you know, Norman Miller was the one who said, you know, in a family, when there's someone born into that family and became a writer, well, that family is basically screwed. Because basically the kid grow up and basically take the material, you know, mom and dad fought all the time. Well, okay, you know, and you know, that becomes his material. That's his experience. So, you know, my parents read the book, but they never tell me how they feel. But I know that they're proud and wary. Because one time recently when my mom was going off on something and I said, yeah, that's really interesting, my dad stopped her. He said, be careful, he may quote you, be careful. So, you know, and I have to say, you know, I was being very honest about my fights with my parents and the discrepancy between our political point of views. So it's not easy for my father to read the book, you know, because basically I was talking about my coming to myself and how that cut certain loyalty bond with my father. But it was an honesty that, you know, you cannot write something memoirish without addressing an honesty, emotional honesty. So I think in the end, I have done honor to them by being honest to myself, you know. Okay, I'll read some more since there's all these faces staring at me. I'm going to read Accent. I read it this morning, but I liked that essay, so I'm going to read it again. Uncle Te, my father's older brother, was a studious man. He arrived in America from Vietnam at the age of 44, but nevertheless struggled to re-educate himself. He went to school nightly, got a BA, and then, through Herculean effort, graduated from law school. But that was when things started to fall apart for him. Uncle Te's accent was so thick that none of his interviews proved fruitful. No one wanted to hire him, not even as a paralegal. After a dozen or so interviews, he gave up. Listen, get rid of any slight suggestion of an accent, he would tell me bitterly. Americans turn a deaf ear to foreign accents. You never get anywhere fast if you sound like a foreigner. I already knew as much. Although I was 11 when I came here and now comfortable with the language, whenever I get nervous, my accent thickens. It's as if I'm back in my 7th grade English class and forced to read a passage from some book out loud. I can hear the snickering from my classmates as I stumble over difficult passages. not understanding a word. So I practiced and practiced and practiced. Every morning in the shower as I got ready for school, I would open my mouth and enunciate certain words learned the day before, listening to their vibrations against the towel. Business, I would pronounce. Stress, I would shout. Necessary. I could almost see the words with their sharp edges and round arches taking shape in the steamy air. I would try my best to rule over them. But I also knew that it was far harder to bend one's tongue to accommodate the American ear than to assimilate. My uncle, for instance, was not rejected for lacking qualifications or intelligence. It was his unruly tongue that gave his foreignness away, pronouncing him interminably alien and unfortunately unemployable. Uncle To never found a satisfying job. After a while, he resorted to working in his wife's grocery store in the Mission District in San Francisco and smoked and drank himself to death. He had believed in the American dream, but its golden door was shut on him at the last minute. On his deathbed, ravaged by throat cancer, Uncle To whispered inaudible words and gasped for air. It's been more than a decade now since he passed away, but I think of him sometimes at cocktail parties or conferences. I try to enunciate my words carefully, masking my foreignness with my Californian accent. In the back of my mind, I hear Uncle's warnings. Speak like Connie Chung and you're okay. Talk like me and you end up running a grocery store. Then the other day, I took a friend to a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, and the waiter, newly arrived from Hong Kong, told us to take the table to the night, having failed to pronounce the R in the word right. Sure, my friend snickered, and we'll probably stay till morning. A funny retort, surely, but it reminded me of Uncle To on his deathbed, and I was suddenly overwhelmed by an intense sadness. Cindy, I whispered to her, listen, I have something to tell you. Yeah, she said, as she leaned over and combed back her golden hair, ready to hear me divulge my secrets. But I had nothing to say. Instead, I did something that left us both in shock. I leaned over, stuck out my tongue, and swiftly licked her ear. You can laugh.
Did she?
Did she what?
Did she laugh?
I let your imagination play with that. More questions? Yes.
Can you think of your Vietnamese, the kind of values, the customs, kind of thing? Do you think of that in America as your liability or your asset?
Huh, good question. You know, usually people say, how much are you Vietnamese and how much are you American? And I feel like I have to take out a barometer and say, well, today I feel 60-40, you know, but that's not true. I think, you know, when we divide it like that, it's always a kind of difficult way for me to answer because, you know, I'm so complicated. And when I say I'm Vietnamese or American, I feel like I'm lying a little bit because I'm much more than those words, you know? And so I would never say my Vietnameseness is against my Americanness because for me, my whole task of being a writer, a large part of it is trying to incorporate two very different segments of my life into something that is functional. And for me, that's the function of art and being expressive. So in that sense, I'm constantly instructed by my Vietnameseness and my Americanness. You know, they add to the richness of my life. And when I get drunk, I speak French, so that's another thing. So, yeah.
Did you find it hard for you or your family to adapt to the American culture?
Well, I think we adjust at different rate. We came at the same time, but we adjust differently. And it has to do with how you feel a lot of time emotionally. For instance, I adjusted very quickly because I had associated at the beginning, when I first came, with everything Vietnamese was negative. I mean, when I was, in junior high, I just wanted to get as far as possible from everything of my past, because I wanted to fit in, want to learn English, be regular guy, So I adjusted very quickly, and that has to do with my desire of wanting to move forward. My parents suffer because they were so full of longing for the past that they didn't want to adjust. I mean, it's not that they weren't capable of, and in some way my father certainly did when he had to get his MBA and so on. But culturally, emotionally, he remained very Vietnamese. He, even when he got his MBA and worked in the bank, he didn't go to baseball because he didn't get baseball. So, so he resisted America the way I would never have resisted America. He found solace in being very Vietnamese, whereas I didn't find solace being very Vietnamese. I find my true self is just integrating a lot of different things. Yeah.
How long have you been at NPR, and how did that opportunity come up?
Oh, okay. A fluke. I've been doing NPR commentary since probably '98. I haven't done much this year because I was working on my other book, which is done now, thank God. Get it published soon, please. That I was having lunch with my boss and Ellen Weiss, executive producer of All Things Considered. And she just basically was talking about something, and I said, well, I have a commentary for that. And so I just faxed it to her, and then I didn't have email in '97, I swear. But anyway, and then I remember she's like, oh, this one doesn't work so well, but can you do something else? And I did, and then I taped for that. And since then, except for this year, I have been doing regular commentaries for them. And I've been on other shows like Morning Edition and News and Notes and some other stuff. But basically, it's really fun to do commentaries for radio because although people don't remember what the heck you say, they say it was very good, and then they email you. They find your email and I really enjoy your commentary. And you get people from as far as Nebraska and Alaska and even in Europe who hear the podcast and email me. And it's always nice to hear people so far writing to you, It's cool. Yeah, back there.
How did you meet Richard Rodriguez? And, how is he talking to do it forward?
Yeah, Richard Rodriguez, I'm sure some of you have heard of him because he's on the Jim Lehrer Hour all the time. And he's sort of my mentor. When I first joined Pacific News Service, this is how I joined it. I was in the creative writing program at San Francisco State University. And I had to take an autobiography class. And everyone there except me was white. And I was the only non-native English speaker. And we had to write a 3-page autobiography and read it out loud in the classroom. And I was really nervous, and so I really polished this thing and worked really hard. And then finally, it was my turn to read it, and I read it. And when I looked up, the classroom was in tears, including the professor. And that was a shock to me because, wow, these people were crying from something I wrote, And then one of the classmates was a journalist because it's a master program, and so she gave my essay to Richard Rodriguez. And then he called me up with Sandy Close, who was his co-editor at Pacific News Service, and they wanted me to come to lunch, and they wanted me to write for this news service, and I thought, that's weird, I didn't want to be a journalist. I don't even read the paper regularly, and here's these people asking me to write for the news service. And I didn't want to go, but then there was a Christmas party, and I like parties. So I went, and then they say, write something about Christmas, because this is about 2 weeks before Christmas. So that was my first essay ever for a newspaper, was my memory of Christmas in Vietnam. In fact, it's in here. Christmas in Dalat, Christmas in San Francisco. And so I got a check and a couple clippings from newspaper, and I was completely stoked. I mean, like, my God, money for this thing. And then Richard sat me down and he said, did you know you can be literary in nonfiction? And I didn't think that was possible back then, because I thought, I read the paper and it's always like he say, she say, it's so boring, And then he showed me some other stuff like Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe, and I thought, oh my God, you can actually do all this with nonfiction, and I was totally hooked. And so I got hired, and I did all this reporting and traveled the world. It's so kind of crazy because I know a lot of people who want to be journalists and have a hard time getting in, and I didn't want to be a journalist, and I ended up as one. So I got blown sideways through it. So Richard has been a mentor and now a very good friend. But I hear he's very expensive to get. Someone else raised their hand. No? Yes?
In one of Richard Rodriguez's books is part of the shared reading.
Yeah.
Under memory, he talks about a private and a public identity.
Yeah.
And then when the Bamboo Among the Oaks panel was here, one of them mentioned feeling like two different people depending on whether they're speaking English or Hmong.
Yeah.
And you brought up both those things in your first essay. And I wondered if you could comment on that or elaborate on that a little more in terms of developing an American identity, that idea of inside and outside and
Yeah.
feeling like two different people.
It's funny because we do, a lot of us come from a different ethnic background. And if you belong to, say, the Church of Mormon, that's also a private society. So to me, the longer I live here, I realize that even when I talk about the inside, the refugee inside, I'm still talking about America, because that's also an American experience. And it's kids like me who grew up and try to connect the private and the public, because public, we go to school, we speak the same language, we play football, basketball, and all that. But private, we have all these spheres that it's kind of exclusive sometimes for the rest of the people who don't have access. But I'm not talking about culture that is so remote that you can't get in at all. I'm talking about even in private culture. It's Americanized culture, My mom may be mourning for the past, but she loves football, for instance. So we might be mourning the past, and then we turn on and watch the 49ers. So there is something very Americana about the private culture as well. It's not as if it's completely inaccessible to the rest of the world. It just needs someone to give voice to it. I think, in fact, a lot of comedians find a lot of cachet talking about it. One of the Vietnamese who won the Last Comic Standing, it was the first reality TV show. He made fun of his mom's accent, and her Vietnameseness. And in fact, a lot of immigrant comedians make fun of their mothers, So we may say, oh, it's such a different culture, but we always, take advantage of it to become more American. Come on, you have more questions, I'm sure. Yeah.
What was it like the first time you went back to Vietnam?
First time going back to Vietnam was great. I mean, I cry my eyes out. I mean, basically, between 1975 to 1990, 91, 92, a lot of Vietnamese now in the United States didn't think they would ever see their homeland again, because the Cold War was such that people who left never expected to go back, under communist rule. The Iron Curtain was as impenetrable as the Wall of China, I guess. It was so hard to imagine going back and visit. But when it opened up, people started coming home and visit and so on. It was a relief because, I left Vietnam in a very dramatic way, never managed to say goodbye to people and the house, the dogs, and anything. So going back was a way to come to terms with that loss. And, for a long time, my memory of Vietnam kind of, like a film roll. You just film everything and then you stop at this particular date, April 1975, and it stayed static with me. I couldn't imagine Vietnam going on. But to actually be there and see young people, to see a dynamic society and so on, is to be able to say, actually, I didn't lose that country. It was always there, I'm just now re-experiencing it, and I didn't lose the country, I'm regaining a country. So it was very good for me to go back the first time. And then I came back a couple of times to do documentaries, and now I'm invited to go, and I don't because there's so many more places to visit. So it became mundane now, which is a good thing. It's only, you can get nostalgic when it's inaccessible, but when you're there, it's kind of hard to be nostalgic. You raised your hand, did you? Fairy tales?
Yeah, with sad endings.
Yeah.
What was when you heard about the American stories with happy endings?
Yeah.
How did you,
What do I make of it? Yeah. That's the one contrast, because in Vietnam, parents tell very sad stories, sad fairy tale. Like one of the story in the book that I talked about was this whole idea that the princess falls in love with this fisherman, and then he left and she died, and her heart turned into a piece of jade, and then they carved that into a tea bowl, and every time they pour hot water or tea, and his image appeared. And when I was a child, I'm like, my God, everything is so morbid. There's no happy ending. Whereas, in America, the train can always, go over the hill, and, Hansel and Gretel kill the witch, No, and I don't know, it's such contrast. Like, wow, Americans are spoon-fed this happy ever after, and Vietnamese are told, yeah, she's gonna die, and for a while in America, I used to make fun of Vietnamese fairy tale because, like, oh, forget, they're gonna die, But there is a maturity about old world fairy tale because, that's, Grimm's fairy tale is also very tragic. The Little Mermaid, in the French and the European version, killed herself. It's only American version that she married and lived happily ever after. And there is a purpose in a world in which you are constantly at war and, ravaged by uncertainties, is that sad ending fairy tales become a warning, a way to say, this is what you're gonna face when you grow up. Life is full of unexpectation and tragedies, and fairy tale has a way to warn children of those things. But there is also a spiritual aspect to those stories. The mermaid killed herself, but she did it in a way so that she didn't have to kill the prince, because that was the French version that I remember as a child, is that the only way for her to gain back her fishiness or whatever was to to kill him for some reason, and she decided not to and died. And I thought, there is something also magical in that. The fisherman came back and realized that the princess did love him, and he cried, and his tear fell into the bowl, and it melted back into blood. There is requited longing. There is a spiritual connection, even when life is tragic. And that's the message of the old world that I come to realize much older in age in America. Yeah.
We're talking about the stories and stuff like that. Well, in America, kids have like the boogeyman and the monster under the stairs and stuff like that. They have that in Vietnam.
Yeah, no, in Vietnam we have real ghosts. We don't need boogeyman. In Vietnam, there was a study recently that said 1 out of 3 Americans believe that ghosts exist. Well, in Vietnam, if they ever do a poll, it would be like 9 out of 10. People see ghosts all the time, and it's hard to say whether or not they imagine or see it because, for instance, we pray to our ancestors. So we have altars. And in the altars are faces of the dead, And so every night, for instance, my grandmother, when she was alive, and my mom still does, she pray and talk to ghosts, basically. Ancestor worshiping is talking to the spirit of the dead. So it's not, impossible for them to see grandfather appearing somewhere and talk to them. In fact, when my grandmother say, "Oh yeah, I saw grandpa last night," I wouldn't ask like, "Did you see him in a dream, or did you see him sitting across you at the coffee table?" We just like, "Wow, so what did he say?" So kind of accept that as part of the way the old world accept death and the cycle of life. What was your question? Yeah, so in a way, the aspect of the spirit world is very much part of the Vietnamese psyche. So we didn't have to scare each other with boogeyman or anything. Besides, we had a war, remember? So, but Vietnamese can tell really great ghost stories,
So when Vietnamese kids come to the U.S. and see the kids running off scared of the boyfriend, and start laughing at them, like, what are you guys running from?
Yeah. It was funny because, my grandmother was in her late 60s, early 70s when she came to the United States. And she was already a little senile. And our first Halloween in the United States, and I remember this very clearly because in retrospect, it's so funny. But she looked out the window and there's all these people in ghost costumes, but her eyesight is not that good. And then she said, there are demons and ghosts outside. But the way she said it was like, if you actually, because she didn't know what Halloween was about, So, but she said it in a way that you would say, look, mom's coming home or something, It's like, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid and she wasn't terribly interested. And then we was like, demons and ghosts. So we're now like all these people in costumes, And then one of us explained to grandma that it's a Halloween, and she said, okay, But her first impression was there's some kind of demon. And in San Francisco, it's foggy, so people dress up in costume. But she wasn't either scared or surprised. And to me, it was quite amazing to think about it now. It's like there's demons and ghosts outside, walking over there. Okay, grandma. You live in a world where there are more dead people than live people, and you kind of, get used to it, I guess. Yeah.
Hollywood has come up with a lot of films about the Vietnam War. I'm just curious, have you seen them? Are you interested in them? What's the general Vietnamese refugee reaction to?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, Hollywood doesn't get anything right. I mean, it gets what it wants to get, and so I could say yes, I'm upset because the Vietnamese portrayal is just one-dimensional, black pajama, conical hat figure that gets shot without any good lines, and in here I mentioned that I have a friend who makes a living dying on the Hollywood set, spouting out blood and screaming, blasphemies in Vietnamese. But, you can be upset at Hollywood, but it doesn't do much good because, in the end, they will do whatever they need to make money. But what fascinates me now is that there are young Vietnamese making movies. So you're seeing a series of new films being made by Vietnamese Americans that are addressing that wrong. Vietnam was a complicated war. Vietnamese were killing Vietnamese far worse than American killing Vietnamese. And the aftermath of that war and what happened to both people in re-education camp. So there are movies coming out that are addressing those issues. So I'm kind of optimistic that, in 10, 20 years, I was among the first, but I'm not the last in my generation who will continue to address the meaning of that war. You look at World War II, and some of the best literature that came out was in the 60s. So it's 30-something years that after the World War that you get all these testimonies and stuff that come out. So I'm hopeful that I'm just at the beginning of the renaissance of Vietnamese American telling their stories. Yeah.
Are you surprised at Vietnam today, the way people are living and capitalism kind of creeping into the
Yeah. Sure. I'm surprised, but the people the most surprised are the communists themselves, who, when they came in and they tried to revolutionize, have a cultural revolution in Vietnam, and they ended up becoming more capitalistic than American, And it's funny because some of the best social programs exist in places like Australia and Europe and not in socialist country like Vietnam. Vietnam has no health care, no education to speak of, and everything is functioning on how much money you have. In fact, the communists are having a meeting recently to try to rename their Communist Party into something else, maybe Red Capitalist or something, but but they're embarrassed because, they're so rich, the Communist Party members, and they send their kids to school in the United States, and they have no ideology, so they're having a hard time explaining their position and their ideology at this point. Is that it? Another passage, okay. Okay, 2 passports. I guess I'll go out with 2 passports. No, it's good. 2 passports, one new, the other old, arrived yesterday. The new, with its tough blue cover and pristine, rigid pages that still resist my prying fingers, is a stark contrast to the ink-stained mud-smear epic next to it, now punctured and rendered obsolete. In the old passport, I am a young man looking out to custom officers everywhere, with a kind of trusting optimism. The skin that glows, the red lips, the dark, wavy hair that draped over my brows all convey something of innocence. A young man on a quest. In the new passport, the photo shows someone else entirely. A weathered man approaching middle age with a sad smile and fine wrinkles around his eyes, and worse still, a receding hairline. I look at this photo, myself in present, and wonder where did the time go? Every man is vain, and I, of course, am no exception. In my late 20s, I was often mistaken for a college student instead of a guest lecturer. And it was only a few years ago that a new intern at my news service mistook me for a fellow intern and not her editor. Then who knows when exactly the wrinkles came and the hair fell and fell and fell. In search of meanings and solace, I flipped through the old passport. The entry and exit stamps from various countries flutter out and hang in the ether like musical notes from some nostalgic rhapsody. France, and I'm in my lover's arms in an attic in winter, looking out to the Seine where snow is falling on a gilded bridge. Vietnam, I'm sailing down the river toward the perfumed pagoda amidst limestone mountains while white cranes fly overhead. Mexico, my best friend and I are eating conch and drinking margaritas on a white sandy beach, the Atlantic Ocean lapping at our bare feet. Nepal, I'm sleeping near the world's rooftop with the roundest and brightest moon I've ever seen hanging out my window and turning the top of Mount Everest into a glorious blue dome. A parade of beatific moments comes flooding back and gives me courage to look at the photo in the new passport once more. I now see that it's not a sad smile. It's a knowing smile. After all, mine is what it should be, a traveler's face. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope you'll join us in the terrace room, and you can talk to Andrew personally and chat with him a little more and maybe have him sign your book or buy the book if you haven't purchased it already. Thank you for coming out.